Alien leaders panicked. You imprisoned. Human children, do you understand what you've started? The notification came through at 4:47 station time, and I had exactly 3 seconds of confusion before every nerve in my body turned to ice. I am Ambassador Sarava's Humanities Cultural Liaison aboard the Galactic Concord Station. I have been doing this job for 9 years. I have negotiated trade boundaries with species that breathe methane. I have sat across tables from beings who regard human emotion as a mild biological defect. I thought nothing could shake me anymore. I was wrong. The message on my console was written in the calm formatted language that the VKAI Enforcement Division used for all official communications. Clean paragraphs, numbered sections, neat timestamps. The kind of message a machine might write if it had never once been asked to understand what it was processing. It said in full, "Attention Galactic Concord Authority, 18 unregistered biological entities of unknown classification were apprehended at 3:19 station time and restricted research. Corridor 7, entities are secured in Containment Block 4, Level 9 facility. Delta 3, species verification pending. Estimated processing timeline 14. Standard cycles. No injuries reported. Protocol followed." I read it twice, then I read it a third time because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were showing it. 18 children. They had 18 children. The youth exchange program had been my idea. I had pushed for it for 2 years, written the proposals myself, revised them 6 times, argued in front of 3 separate committees. The concept was simple. Bring a small group of human children to the Concord as cultural observers. Let other species see us not as diplomats or engineers or soldiers, but as something smaller and more honest. Let them see that we were a people who produced children who were curious and kind and wanted to learn. The group was 18 students between the ages of 10 and 14. Their lead chaperone was a retired teacher named Owen Garrett, who had spent 30 years teaching middle school science and who had described the trip as the most extraordinary thing he would ever do. There were 3 additional adult supervisors. Their shuttle had drifted 2 km off course during a routine navigation exercise because one of the students, a boy named Callum, had asked if he could try the controls, and the supervising pilot had thought it would be a fine educational moment. 2 km. That was all it took. The breath had intercepted them without hesitation and without curiosity. To the breath, a vessel in a restricted corridor was a vessel in a restricted corridor. The life forms inside were unregistered, unknown, and therefore required processing. They had followed their own rules with perfect precision and had not once stopped to wonder whether their rules made sense. I had my console open before I finished reading the message a third time. I sent a direct alert to every human diplomat and officer on the station using a contact flag reserved for genuine emergencies. Then I pulled up the external communications hub and began to run. Corridors of the Concord were mostly quiet at that hour. The station ran on a universal cycle that loosely mimicked a 26-hour day, and most non-human residents were in rest state. I passed 2 Solhari crew members who looked at me with the mild interest their species showed toward fast-moving humans, which was mostly the same look they gave to weather. I reached the communications hub in 4 minutes, and I stopped in the doorway, there were already 11 people. There, 11 human beings who had read the same notification I had and made the same calculation and moved. A young communications officer named Lucy Farrow was already on a direct line to Facility Delta 3, speaking in a voice so controlled it sounded mechanical. A structural analyst named Pete Norris had a three-dimensional map of the Bread-Eye facility on his screen and was marking access corridors with a stylus. In quick, precise strokes, two diplomats, whose names I could not remember in that moment, were drafting something on a shared screen so quickly their fingers were blurring. Nobody was panicking. Nobody was raising their voice. That was the thing that would later stay with me longest in the days and weeks that followed, when other species asked me to describe the first human response to the news. I told them the truth. We were not loud. We were not frantic. We became very, very quiet and very, very fast, and the combination of those two things was something that the rest of the galaxy had never quite seen before. Owen Garrett's emergency locator was active and transmitting. He and the other 3 adult supervisors were in a separate holding area from the students, which I would later learn was because the breath had categorized them differently based on size and apparent maturity. Owen had already sent 3 official requests through the standard communication protocols available to him. All 3 had been logged, acknowledged, and placed in a processing queue with an estimated response time of 6 standard cycles, 6 cycles, roughly 4 and 1/2 days. Lucy flagged me from her console without looking up. I have a VKAI junior administrator on the line. She's explaining that the processing timeline cannot be expedited without a verification of species documentation from a recognized galactic authority. She is being very polite about it. Lucy paused. I'm also being very polite about it. Keep her on the line, I said. Pete looked up from his map. There are 42 human personnel currently aboard the station. I have already heard from 38 of them. I expect the other 4 are either in the shower or have not yet checked their consoles. He said this without any particular expression. I also want you to know that I have identified 4 separate routes to Facility Delta 3 that do not pass through any formally restricted corridors. I looked at him. Pete, we are not going to extract them ourselves. I know that, he said, and went back to marking the map. I just think information is useful. I pulled up the emergency diplomatic channel and put in a priority request for a direct line to the Rifkai High Council. The automated system informed me that the High Council convened at the start of their active cycle, which would begin in approximately 9 hours. I stared at that message for a moment, then I overwrote it using an emergency access code that I had been given when I first took this position that I had never once used, that was technically reserved for events posing an imminent threat to galactic stability. I used it and I did not feel even slightly sorry. While I waited for the connection to process, I thought about the 18 students. I thought about a girl named Priya who had asked me the week before the trip whether she could bring a notebook to write down new words she learned from alien languages. I thought about Callum, who had told me solemnly that he had studied 3 galactic star maps and had opinions about all of them. I thought about all of them sitting in a containment block somewhere in a facility designed to hold unknown Biological entities, not knowing how long they would be there or whether anyone was coming, and then I thought, they know someone is coming, they know it because that is what we teach our children. We teach them that the adults will come, we teach them to hold on. I was going to make sure that was true. The connection to the High Council processing system pinged, accepted, and queued. Estimated wait time 90 minutes. I settled into a chair, pulled my console onto my lap and got to work. In the corridor outside the hub, I could hear more footsteps, more humans awake and moving, drawn by the same invisible thread that had pulled all of us to the same place at the same hour. We had all gotten the message, we had all understood it, and none of us, not one, was going back to sleep. The stars outside the station window were very still. Somewhere behind them 18 children were waiting, and we were not the kind of people who kept children waiting. Equals 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 equals. The connection to the VK High Council finally opened at 6:23 station time, and the council member who appeared on my screen looked mildly inconvenienced. His name was Counselor V. Thrawn, a senior administrator with 20 standard years of galactic service and the calm, unhurried expression of someone who had never once been told that his calendar was subject to revision. He said, "Ambassador Voss, we acknowledge your priority request. Please understand that this channel is designated for matters of galactic emergency. We will be filing a formal note regarding its use for what appears to be an administrative matter," I said. "Counselor, the Breathkai Enforcement Division is currently holding 18 human children in Containment Block 4 of Facility Delta 3. They have been there for over 3 hours. I am requesting their immediate release." V. Thrawn looked at a document to his left. "Yes, we are aware. The entities are being processed. According to standard protocol, they will be released upon species verification, which requires documentation from a recognized galactic authority. We have already communicated this through the appropriate channels. They are children." I said. "They are 10 to 14 years old." He looked at me with the particular expression the Rifkai used when they felt a conversation had moved into territory they found illogical. The classification of the entities is pending verification. Until that process is complete, standard containment protocols apply regardless of biological age indicators. I took a breath. "Counselor, I want to make sure you understand what I am telling you. We have 18 human children in your facility. Not adult personnel, not diplomatic staff. Children, I need you to release them. The process will complete in the estimated time frame," he said, and the very gentleness of his tone made something in my chest tighten. He was not cruel. He genuinely did not understand. That was in its own way the most frightening thing I had encountered in 9 years of this work. "We can discuss the documentation requirements at the next schedule." "There will not be a next scheduled anything," I said, and my voice came out lower and quieter than I expected. "Counselor, I am going to ask you one more time to release those children, and then I am going to ask you to think very carefully about what happens after I stop asking." He paused. It was a small pause, barely a second. Then he said, "Ambassador, we do not respond well to pressure of this nature. Human emotional appeals are noted, but galactic protocol." I closed the channel. Behind me, Pete said quietly, "Did that Go the way you expected. No, I said. It went exactly the way I was afraid it would. I turned around. The hub had 23 people in it now. At some point in the last 90 minutes, someone had brought coffee, which was sitting in a large thermal container on the side counter. And someone else had thought to bring food, which nobody was eating. 23 human beings in a room, all working, all focused, all pulling in the same direction with the particular silent coordination that our species produced. Under specific kinds of pressure, our chief negotiator, Marcus Hale, had arrived at some point while I was on the call. I had not noticed him come in. He was standing at the far end of the hub with a tablet in his hand and the look on his face that I recognized as his working expression, which is to say, no expression at all. Marcus was 51 years old and had spent the last 23 of those years in galactic diplomacy. He had helped write 4 of the major trade accords currently governing interspecies commerce. He was one of the most patient people I had ever met. I had seen him sit through an 8-hour negotiation with the Fandry delegation without once showing irritation. He was not patient. Now he was something else. He was the kind of still that very deep water gets just before something large moves beneath the surface. He said, I have been on the line with the Galactic Emergency Coordination Office. They have logged our request as Priority 2, which means it will be reviewed within 48 hours. The room went quiet in a particular way. 8 hours. Lucy repeated, yes. She turned back to her console without another word. Pete updated something on his map. 2 people across the room exchanged a look that communicated an entire conversation. Without a single word spoken, Marcus said, I am now going to send a direct message to every member of the Galactic Conquered Authority Council, not through standard channels, through the emergency override frequency, the one that gets read immediately, regardless of cycle timing. Someone said that frequency is reserved for extinction level events. Yes, Marcus said. No one argued. The message he composed was short. I read it over his shoulder. It said, the Breathka Enforcement Division is currently holding 18 human children in facility Delta II. They have been held for 4 hours and 17 minutes. We are requesting immediate intervention by the Galactic Conquered Authority. Humanity is formally placing this event on record as an active diplomatic emergency. We expect a response within 2 hours. We will not be asking again. He sent it. Then he set the tablet down and picked up the coffee that someone handed him. Outside the station windows, the stars had not moved. They never did, but something in the quality of the silence in that room had shifted, and I think every one of us felt it at the same moment. Counselor Yira of the Tandri reached me 40 minutes later on a secondary line. She was one of the oldest members of the Galactic Council, and her species bioluminescent markings shifted through colors when she was feeling strong emotion, which made it difficult for her to hide how she was doing. Right now she was cycling through a soft, rapid amber that I had learned over years meant anxiety. She said, Ambassador Voss, I received the emergency message. I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me honestly. Of course, I said. How many combat-capable human adults are currently within 2 standard light cycles of Facility Delta 3? I looked at her for a moment, then I said, Counselor, I am not in a position to Give you military positioning data. She was quiet. The amber deepened. I see. She said very softly, I understand. What she understood, I think, was that she had gotten her answer. She ended the call and I watched the connection close. And I thought about what it meant that a species as old and steady as the Tandri was already asking that question. They had been watching humans for 60 years. They knew something that the Breathkai, in their procedural certainty, apparently did not. They knew what we looked like when we had decided. Something at 8:41, an encrypted data packet arrived from Facility Delta 3. It was not sent by the Bread administration. It was sent by Owen Garrett, who had apparently convinced the junior administrator on duty to allow him single outgoing message by explaining to her calmly and methodically that he was a teacher and that teachers required information about the welfare of their students as a matter of professional necessity, and that he would continue explaining this every 20 minutes until she agreed. The message said all 18 students accounted for and unharmed, holding together, well, have divided into 3 groups for activities to maintain focus. Callum organized a history quiz. Priya is cataloging the cells. Ventilation system by sound, says it's a science project. 3 students are scared and we are managing that. Food and water have been provided, though the food is unidentified and tastes like cardboard soaked in copper, and 2 students have named it Mystery Surprise and are pretending to enjoy it to make the younger ones feel better. Adult supervisors all well. We know you are coming. Please come soon. Marcus Hale read the message. He read it twice, then he set the tablet on the counter, faced the wall for about 6 seconds and picked it back up. The food tastes like cardboard soaked in copper, Lucy said, and her voice had something in it that was not quite laughter and not quite anything else. Callum organized a history quiz, Pete said, and he sounded like a man who had just remembered something important about his species. I did not say anything. I sat down because my legs had decided they were done holding me upright for the moment, and I looked at the message again. They were scared. 3 of them were scared and the others were managing it. They were 10 and 11 and 12 and 13 and 14 years old, and they were in a cell in an alien facility, and they were managing it because that was what human children did when the adults in their lives had spent years teaching them that they were capable and that help was coming and that they were not alone. Marcus said, I want a response from the Galactic Authority Council the next 60 minutes. If we do not have one, I am escalating to what? Someone asked. I have not decided yet, he said, but I will know it when I get there. I looked at the clock. The children had been in that cell for 5 hours and 22 minutes. In 14 days, according to VKAI protocol, they would be processed and released pending verification. 14 days. We were not going to wait 14 days. We were not going to wait 14 hours, and any species that had watched humans long enough knew somewhere in the quiet part of their understanding that children were a line you did not cross. I refilled my coffee. I went back to my console. I started drafting the next communication. Equals 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 at 9:15 station time. The Galactic Concord Emergency Council session was called, not by humanity, by 4 other species simultaneously. I know this because I was in the secondary communication center when the session request came through and I watched the names appear on the authorization log one after another. Within a span of 6 minutes, the Fandry filed first, then the Sohari, then the Mavari Collective, which almost never called for emergency sessions and had last done so 32 years ago during the boundary crisis near the outer arm, and then quietly the Orth, who were so old and so deliberate that when they moved quickly it meant something extraordinary was happening. No one had called humanity, we had simply filed our emergency notification. And the rest of the galactic community had looked at it, looked at each other, and decided that the room needed to be in the same place at the same time. Marcus Hale and I went to the session. Together, the chamber was not fully open to the gallery yet, but I had observer credentials and I used them. I sat in the upper gallery above the main floor and looked down at an ancient, high-ceiling room that had hosted 10,000 years of interspecies negotiation, and I watched the various delegations take their seats with the particular focused energy of people who had all read the same document and were trying to decide what it meant. The Vigai delegation arrived last. There were 3 of them, led by Grand Administrator Chovas, tall angular figure with the rigid posture that Rithgai administrators maintained as a cultural habit. They sat down without acknowledging the other delegations and arranged their documents with calm, precise movements. Grand Arbiter Keth Solon of the Dominion opened the session with the standard procedural language and then paused in a way that was not standard at all. He said, "The Council has convened on an emergency basis following the galactic notification filed by the human diplomatic mission. The matter concerns the detention of 18 human juvenile entities at Facility Delta 3 by the Bredi Enforcement Division. We will hear first from the Vreka administration." Grand Administrator Chav stood and spoke for 4 minutes. In brief, the Vreka Enforcement Division had followed all applicable protocols. The entities had been apprehended lawfully under corridor access regulations. The species verification process was proceeding at standard pace. The entities were unharmed. All communications from the human mission had been received, logged, and were being reviewed. The Bredi saw no cause for emergency intervention and respectfully questioned the appropriateness of the current session. He sat down. The chamber was quiet in the way a room gets quiet when 20 separate species are all having the same thought at the same moment. Counselor Yatra of the Tandri stood. She did not ask to be recognized. She simply stood, and Keth Solon, who was wise enough to know when to let someone speak, nodded at her. She said, "I must ask the human delegation directly. How long have the children been detained?" At this time, Marcus from the main floor said, 6 hours and 41 minutes. She nodded slowly. Her bioluminescent markings were a steady amber. She said, "And how many of the human mission personnel on the station would you describe as functioning normally at this current moment?" Marcus looked at her. For a moment, "None," he said. She sat back down. She did not say anything else, but she did not need to. The amber on her markings shifted briefly to a color I had no name for. The session continued. Several delegations asked procedural questions. The Mavari Collective submitted a formal query about the applicable definition of juvenile entity under the current Galactic Charter, which was a real and valid question that would eventually matter a great deal. The Bress answered everything calmly and correctly, and with the unshakable certainty of people who genuinely believed they had done nothing wrong. And then something happened that changed the temperature of the room entirely. A data packet arrived, marked as supplementary evidence and filed by the human mission. Marcus had arranged it before the session. It was the contents of the daily log being maintained by Owen Garrett from inside the facility, updated through his one permitted outgoing message per hour, which the junior administrator had continued to allow because, as she would later explain to her supervisors, he had asked so reasonably and so consistently that denying him had begun to feel strange. The packet was read into the record. I watched the chamber as it was read. The children had organized a daily schedule. Morning began with what they called science observation, which was Priya's ventilation mapping project, now joined by 4 other students who had decided it was interesting. Midday was academics. Callum's history quiz had expanded into a full rotating lesson structure where each student taught the others something they knew. 2 students were doing mathematics. One was teaching basic astronomy. A girl named Sophie had apparently been conducting informal language lessons from a phrase guide she had downloaded to her tablet before the trip, and 3 other students had joined her class. There was a section in the log about the small creature Priya had found living in the ventilation access behind a loose panel. Owen's log described it as mouse-like, about the size of a fist, with 6 legs and large reflective eyes. The students had named it Captain Biscuit. They had been leaving small portions of their food near the panel for it. Captain Biscuit had accepted 3 of these offerings and was now permitting Priya to touch its ears. 2 of the Breathkai maintenance workers assigned to the block had, according to the log, begun leaving slightly larger food portions than standard issue. They had not said anything. They had simply left more food and looked at the students for a moment before leaving. Priya had smiled at one of them. He had not smiled back because Rithkai faces were not built for it, but he had paused in a way that Owen noted in his log as meaningful. The chamber was absolutely silent when the log was finished, and then Counselor Vithron said something I did not expect. He did not say it loudly or dramatically. He said it in the same measured tone he used for everything. But he said it, and the words fell into the silence of that chamber like stones into still water. He said, "They are not afraid." He was looking at the record with an expression I had never seen on a Rifkai face, not confusion. Something closer to the early stages of understanding. They have been in a containment facility for nearly 7 hours. They are juveniles in an unfamiliar environment without the presence of their primary guardians, and they are teaching each other mathematics. They are caring for a feral creature they named Captain Biscuit. He paused. They believe someone is coming for them. Marcus Hale said from the floor. Yes, is that certainty rational? Vithron asked. Given the situation. No, Marcus said, it is not rational. It is something else entirely. It is what happens when you spend a decade telling a child that adults keep their promises. He was quiet for a second. And that is why you are going to release them, not because we are threatening you, not because of treaties or trade. implications, or diplomatic consequences. Because those 18 children are sitting in your facility right now believing that the promise is going to be kept, and I am telling you, counselor, in front of this entire chamber that it will be. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. The Solhari ambassador leaned over to her aide and said something in a voice low enough that I could not hear the words, but I could see her expression, and I had never seen that expression on her face before. It was a kind of stunned recognition, the look of someone who has just understood something they had been looking at for a long time without seeing. She glanced up at the gallery and found my eyes. I held her gaze. She looked away first. At the back of the chamber, a junior member of the Rithkai delegation stood and leaned down to whisper something to Grand Administrator Chavs listened, nodded once in, then sat very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Session recessed for 90 minutes. I used that time to sit in the gallery and read the most recent update from Owen Garrett's log. It was short. It said, Priya has now been formally designated Chief Science Officer by group vote. Callum is leading a team effort to memorize the VKAI administrative manual that was left in the cell as what I believe was meant to be light reading material. Apparently, it is extremely interesting, according to 4 students, and extremely boring according to 14, but all 18 are reading it anyway because they have nothing else to do. One student pointed out that it contains a section on species rights during administrative detention that appears to support their immediate release. Callum is annotating it. We are all well. I read that twice. I looked at the ceiling of the gallery for a while. Then I thought about Callum, 13 years old, annotating a Rithkai administrative manual in a containment cell to find the clause that proved he should be released, and I thought about what kind of species produces a child like that. We produce children who do not stop, not because we train them not to stop, but because we show them from the very beginning that stopping is not what people do. You keep going, you keep learning, you keep feeding small 6-legged creatures pieces of your own food ration even when you are frightened because they are smaller than you and you can help. That is what we teach our children. The session resumed. The chamber reconvened. And for the first time since the morning, the breath delegation looked like people who were no longer entirely certain they were standing on solid ground. The second recess of the session lasted 6 minutes, and when Grand Administrator Chav returned to his seat, something in the way he moved had changed. It was subtle. If you had not spent years watching different species carry tension in their bodies, you might not have seen it, but I had spent years doing exactly that, and I saw it clearly. He was uncertain. For a Bretai administrator of his rank and experience, that was an extraordinary thing. The VK guy had built their entire civilization on procedural certainty. Their protocols were not suggestions. They were load-bearing walls. And right now, Chovis was looking at a room full of galactic representatives who were all watching him with a very particular kind of attention, and somewhere behind his carefully maintained composure, he was beginning to understand that the walls had shifted. Marcus Hale had spent the recess standing in the corridor outside the chamber with his tablet and 3 Members of our diplomatic team, I had joined them for the last 4 minutes of it, the message he had received during the first recess, which I had now read twice, was from the Human Government's Economic Coordination Office. It was not a threat, it was a projection. 47 pages of precise, detailed, entirely dispassionate analysis showing what an immediate human withdrawal from galactic trade, research, and cooperative infrastructure would look like over the following year. The numbers were not dramatic in the way of weapons or ultimatums. They were dramatic in the way of mathematics, which does not shout and does not argue and does not care what you think of it. They simply were. And what they showed in 47 comp pages was that 3 separate galactic economies would begin contracting within 24 hours, that 2 joint research programs in advanced materials science would halt, that the medical supply chain serving 4 outer armed species would develop gaps within 60 days. Marcus had not sent this projection to the bread. He had shared it with every other species on the Galactic Council quietly 2 hours ago through standard formational channels. He had framed it as background context. He had not said, "Look what we could do." He had simply shown them the shape of the thing. That was the difference between Marcus Hale and a less careful person. He never threatened, he simply illuminated. The session reconvened, and it was different this time. The energy in the room had a direction now. The Mavari Collective Senior Representative stood and delivered a 17-minute analysis of the applicable species protection provisions under the Galactic Charter. And I will say this, Callum's annotation of the Brethke Administrative Manual had been correct. The VREG's own regulations, read in conjunction with the Galactic Charter, produced a result that the Brethke administration had apparently not anticipated when they filed their initial processing paperwork. It was not a technicality. It was a genuine legal issue, and the BREDI being above all else, procedural people could not simply ignore a genuine legal issue when it was placed in front of them in a chamber they respected. Chovist consulted with his delegation for 12 minutes, then he requested to address the chamber. He said, "The Brethkai Enforcement Division acknowledges the legal analysis presented by the Mavari Collective. We are initiating an internal review of the processing classification applied to the entities in Facility Delta 3. This review will determine whether the correct protocols were followed and whether the classification requires revision." There was a pause in the room. Marcus said from his seat on the floor, "Counselor, I need to be clear. A review is not a release. The review will be conducted." "Counselor," Marcus's voice was the same as it had been all morning. Even level, the kind of voice you used when you had moved past the point where raising it would accomplish anything. "Those children have now been in your facility for 9 hours and 40 minutes. I have been patient because I believe in this process and because I believe that this council and your administration are capable of doing the right thing. I am going to ask you one more time, release them now, today, in the next 2 hours. Not pending a review, not pending verification." "Now," Chovist said, "the protocols." "I understand your protocols," Marcus said. "I have read them. My 13-year-old students have read them. The protocols are not the issue. The issue is that 18 children are in a cell because a shuttle drifted 2 km off course and your Enforcement Division did not stop to ask whether the living things inside it might have people who love them, that is, the issue. He stopped, release them. Counselor, the chamber was still. Vithron, who had been quiet since his observation during the earlier session, spoke not to the chamber to chess. He said something in the Breathkai administrative language that the universal translator rendered as we should give this serious consideration, and then he looked at his hands for a moment. It was the first time I had ever seen a bread administrator look at his hands. Chovist did not respond immediately. Instead, without any announcement, the session was called into a third recess. This one lasted 42 minutes. Marcus sat in the chamber and did not leave. He sat in his chair with his tablet in his lap, and his eyes on the middle distance and the particular stillness of someone who had already decided where they were going to stand and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. I used the 42 minutes to step into the corridor and call the communications hub. Lucy picked up. Update. I said 2 things. She said, first, Arithkai enforcement transfer vessel has filed a flight plan. It is routing through the corridor adjacent to Delta I. We believe they intend to reclassify the children as diplomatic assets and move them to a higher security facility. That classification would give the Bredi a different legal basis for extended detention. I was quiet for 2 seconds, and second, 3 human vessels have already positioned themselves in that corridor. Lucy said none of them are registered as military. One is a supply transport, one is an engineering survey ship, one is a medical courier. They are in the technical sense simply present in the corridor. They have not communicated with the Bredi transfer vessel. They are just there. I looked at the ceiling of the corridor for a moment. Who authorized that? Nobody. Lucy said they just did it. I stood there for a few seconds holding the line. Somewhere 3 human ships were sitting in a corridor, not blocking anyone, not threatening anyone, simply being in a specific place at a specific time with a specificity that was entirely deliberate. They had not been ordered there. They had read the same notification everyone else had read, and they had made a decision, and they had moved. The VK transfer vessels captain had filed an emergency communication with the Galactic Council. Within 20 minutes of discovering the corridor was occupied, he had requested guidance on how to proceed. I do not know exactly what his message said, because it was filed under restricted access, but I know what it accomplished. It accomplished a 4th recess, and after the 4th recess, the session did not resume. Instead, Grand Administrator Chav sent a direct communication to the human mission. It said the Bredi administration is initiating an expedited review effective immediately. Facility Delta II has been directed to prepare the entities in containment Block 4 for supervised transfer to diplomatic custody. This process will be completed within 2 hours pending coordination with your missions. Receiving personnel. I read the message 3 times, then I forwarded it to Marcus. Then I sat down on a bench in the corridor outside the chamber and breathed in a way I had not been breathing all day, which is to say, normally, Marcus's reply came 30 seconds. Later, it contained 3 words: go meet them. I took Lucy with me and Pete and 2 others. We went through the docking corridor to the receiving bay that had been designated for the transfer, and we stood there and waited. And the wait was 23 minutes, and those were 23 of the longest minutes I can remember. The bay doors opened. Oh, Garrett came through first. He looked tired in a way that went into the bones. And when he saw me, his expression did something I am not going to try to describe because I do not have the words for it. Then the students came through. They came through together in a loose, informal group, the way students walk when they are comfortable with each other. They were talking. Callum had his tablet out and was pointing at something. On the screen, a girl named Nell was wearing her jacket tied around her waist, which was such a normal, ordinary thing to see that it almost undid me entirely. Priya came through holding a ventilation filter fashioned into a small enclosure. Inside it, through the mesh, I could see a small creature with 6 legs and large, reflective eyes. Captain Biscuit had made it out. Priya looked at me and said, very seriously, he needs a better enclosure, but this is structurally sound for now. I calculated the airflow requirements. I believe you, I said. Also, she said, I taught 2 VKAI maintenance workers how to play a card game. One of them is very good at it. He cheats, but only a little, and he pretends he does not know that I know. So I pretend I do not know either. It keeps things pleasant. I looked at her. For a moment, she was 12 years old. She had spent 9 hours and 51 minutes in an alien containment facility, and she had cataloged the ventilation system, cared for a stray animal, and established a working social dynamic with the facility's maintenance staff. I said, Priya, you are remarkable. She shrugged in the easy way 12-year-olds shrug when they not sure how to take a compliment. Everyone helped, she said. Callum found the legal clause. Sophie taught language lessons, so everyone was less scared. We all just kept doing things. Owen said doing things helps. Owen is right, I said. She looked past me at the receiving bay's outer windows, at the stars beyond the station glass, and she said, I knew someone would come. I told the others. I said, alts always come. I did not trust my voice for a moment. Then I said, yes, we do. Equals 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 the final count when the receiving bay finished processing. 18 students, 4 adult supervisors, all accounted for, all unharmed, all present. Marcus had been right behind me the whole time, and I had not known it. I turned and he was there, looking at the students the way you look at something you were not entirely sure you would see. And his face was doing things that his face did not normally do, and I am not going to describe that either. Some moments belong to the people inside them. What I will say is that he stood very still for a long moment, looking at all 18 of them, and then he looked at me and said quietly, get them fed, get them to the medical bay for checkups. Tell Owen to write down everything, every detail, because this is going into the record. It did go into the record. But first there were other things, kind of things that happen in the hour after a long, terrible day turns into a good one. There was food, finally real food, which appeared in the receiving bay courtesy of the station's kitchen crew, who had apparently been standing by for the last 4 hours. There was warmth and noise, and the particular sound of 18 children who had been holding themselves together very carefully, suddenly not needing to do that anymore. 2 of the younger students cried, 3 others laughed about something I could not hear from across the room. Owen Garrett sat down on a bench near the wall and did not get up for a while, and the students took turns sitting next to him in the easy way of people who understood that their teacher had also had a hard day. Callum came and found me about 20 minutes after they arrived. He was 13, tall for his age, with the slightly disheveled look of someone who had spent 10 hours in a containment cell and had not thought to check his hair once. He held out his tablet. On the screen was a document 43 pages long with notes and flags and highlighted passages throughout. This is my annotation of the bread administrative manual, he said. The section on species rights in administrative detention starts at page 12. I cross-referenced it with the Galactic Charter addendum from the year 22. The argument is on page 19, I think. It is solid. I looked at him. I know I said it was cited in the legal review. 3 times he blinked. Oh, he said, and then after a moment, with the careful casualness of someone who was very pleased but did not want to appear very pleased, that is good, that is very good, I said. He went back to the group. I watched him go. He sat down next to a younger student who looked like she was struggling to finish her meal. And he said something that made her laugh, and she started eating again. I thought, we do not produce extraordinary children by accident. We produce them on purpose. Every day, in every small choice we make about what we teach them and how we treat them and what we show them is worth doing. Callum did not annotate a Rithkai legal manual because he was a genius. He did it because someone at some point had shown him that when things are hard, you find the tools you have and you use them. You do not wait. You do not stop. You work the problem. Sophie came to find me next. She was 14, the oldest of the students, and she had the self-possessed manner of someone who had decided somewhere around age 11 that she was going to be competent at things and had been following through on that decision ever since. She was holding a small data chip. I wrote down the language notes from the sessions I ran in the cell. She said, basic Rithkai administrative phrasing. I thought it might be useful for future exchanges. The pronunciation is difficult, but the grammar structure is actually fairly logical once you understand that verb order indicates authority level. I took the chip. Thank you, Sophie. She nodded once professionally and went back to her meal. I stood there holding the chip for a moment, thinking about 14-year-olds who spent their time in detention cells, developing a grammar analysis of the language being spoken around them. Then I went to find Marcus. He was in a small office adjacent to the receiving bay on a call with the Galactic Authority Council. I waited outside until the call ended, which took about 8 minutes, and then I knocked. Come in, he said. I went in. He was sitting at a desk with 3 screens open and a half-finished cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. He looked like a man who had run a very long race and had just crossed the finish line and had not yet had time to feel what that meant. I said, how are you? He considered this seriously. I will tell you tomorrow, he said. Right. Now I am still working. What are you working on? He turned one of the screens toward me. It was a draft document, long and detailed, with the header of the Galactic Concord Treaty Office at the top. The Juvenile Sentient Protections Accord. Have a first draft ready within 48 hours. While the memory is fresh, while the council is still. He paused, looking for the right word. While the council is still understanding what they saw today. I looked at the document. It was already 12 pages long. Oh, started this during the session. I started it during the first recess. He said I needed something to do with my hands. I sat down across from him. The office was small and the lighting was the mild, efficient kind that station offices always had, not warm, just adequate. But sitting there with Marcus and his cold coffee and his 12 pages of draft treaty language, I felt something ease in my chest that had been pulled tight since 4:47 that morning. Priya taught the bread-eye maintenance workers a card game. I said. He looked at me. I know Owen's log. She gave them 4 pages of written rules with diagrams. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "The accord needs a provision on informal cultural exchange during administrative proceedings. I am going to add it." I laughed. It came out a little ragged, but it was a real laugh. Marcus smiled, which was a small and private expression on his face, the kind you only caught if you were watching closely. 5 days after the children came home, the Galactic Concord passed the Juvenile Sentient Protections Accord. The driving force behind it was not the human mission alone, it was the other species on the council, most of them who had spent 51 hours watching us and had made a very clear decision about which side of the situation they wanted to be on in the future. The Accord established universal protections for juvenile members of any recognized sentient species. It created mandatory review processes for any enforcement action involving juveniles. It required species identification and cultural sensitivity training for all Galactic Corridor enforcement divisions. It included in Section 14 a provision on the rights of juveniles in administrative detention to maintain educational and cultural activities, which Callum's annotation had directly informed and which Owen Garrett later described with great satisfaction as the most useful homework assignment in the history of interstellar travel. The VTHK signed it. V. Thrawn specifically was one of the early supporters within their administration. I do not know exactly what happened in the conversations between him and Shoves after the session ended, but I know that Vithron spent 3 days requesting access to historical human cultural records, specifically those related to child rearing practices and family structure. He submitted a private message to the human mission afterward that said simply, "We did not know. We understand that this is not sufficient. We are learning." I thought that was honest, and I replied to tell him so. We exchanged 4 more messages over the following weeks. In the last one, he asked me whether humans had always placed this particular weight on their children or whether it was something that had developed over time. I thought about the question for 2 days before I answered. What I told him was this: we are a species that nearly ended itself several times before we found our way to the stars. We lost people we loved in numbers that are difficult to speak about. And somewhere in all of that, we made a decision, not formally, not in any treaty or charter, but in the daily choices of ordinary people, that the children were the line that everything else could be negotiated and compromised and worked out over time, but the children were where we did not move. We have been keeping that decision for a very long time. I told him it has become the structure of us. The 2 VTHK maintenance workers sent a message through official channels to Priya, care of the human mission. It was Brief, it said that they had constructed a proper enclosure for Captain Biscuit, and that he was settling in well and eating regularly. One of them asked in a postscript whether Priya would be willing to send the rules for the card game in written form, as his colleague had a disputed interpretation of one of the scoring rules and they needed an authoritative source. Priya wrote back 4 pages. She included diagrams. I am not sure anyone in the history of galactic diplomacy has established a cross-species friendship through a card game and small animal care in a detention facility, but I have learned in this line of work never to underestimate the methods by which human children find their way to other people. They have an instinct for it that we do not teach them because we do not know how. They simply arrive somewhere new, and they look around and they find the living things that are closest to them, and they begin. Callum's annotation of the Breti Administrative Manual was formally cited 3 times in the final legal review. His school was informed. His mother reportedly said that he was going to make his teachers' lives very interesting for the rest of his academic career and that she could not be prouder. The annotation was eventually published as a supplementary appendix to the legal review documents, where it remains attributed to Callum, age 13. Student Owen Garrett retired from teaching 6 months after the trip. He said the program had been, as he had predicted, the most extraordinary thing he would ever do. He wrote a book about it. I read an advanced copy. He described Captain Biscuit with great accuracy, covered the card games correctly, and wrote about the legal annotation with admirable precision. In the acknowledgments, he thanked all 18 students by name and in alphabetical order. He also thanked simply the adults who came. I sat with my official incident report for 4 days before I finished it. 42 pages of formal diplomatic language, every fact accounted for, every communication logged. The report was accurate and complete and said everything that a report needed to say, and nothing that report could not hold. What I wrote in my private journal the night the children came home was not 42 pages. It was 3 paragraphs. The last one said they asked if our response was instinct or choice. I have thought about this for a long time now, longer than any of the formal review processes, longer than the treaty drafting, longer than anything else that came out of those 51 hours. I think the honest answer is that it stopped being either a long time ago. We have been making that choice for so many generations and making it so completely that it has become the structure of what we are. You cannot separate the choice from the people anymore. They are the same thing, which means that if you want to understand humans, you do not start with our technology or our history or our position in the galactic community. You start with the fact that we are a species that tells its children, someone will come, we promise, hold on, and then we come every single time. Not because we cannot stop ourselves, but because we are the people who always will. I closed the journal. I went to sleep. Outside, the stars kept going the way they always do, indifferent and ancient, and very bright. But somewhere in Facility Delta 3, Captain Biscuit was eating regularly and sleeping in a proper enclosure, and 2 VKAI workers were arguing cheerfully about card game rules, waiting for a 4-page letter from a 12-year-old on the other side of the galaxy who had already decided they were friends, and somewhere on a station in the middle of a very large universe. 18 children were home. That was enough. That was everything.